It is late summer, September 7th of 1695. Feared pirate Captain Henry Every leads his small but formidable fleet aboard his ship, the Fancy. The air is humid and heavy, creating a misty haze. The crew is carrying out their duties mostly in silence as they anxiously await what is to come. Every is in pursuit of the famed Mughal treasure fleet as it was returning to Surat from the Red Sea. Every and his crew had already plundered a slower escort ship, but his sights were set on the flagship, the Ganj-i-Swai, which had slipped away in the night. Drawing closer to the Indian coast, Every fears his prey has escaped, but just then, he spots a sail on the horizon through his spyglass and sets his course to intercept. A lookout on the Ganj-i-Swai alerts his captain of 3 ships approaching from the west. Captain Muhammad Ibrahim at first believes the ships are part of the British East India Company convoy, a common sight in these waters. Every ship is much smaller, but he gambles and orders an attack on the larger and well-defended flagship. Despite being vastly outmanned and outgunned, the Fancy immediately scores a crippling direct hit on the opponent's mainmast. Every closes in on his wounded foe, eager to claim his prize. What followed next would earn Henry Every the distinction as one of the most brutal and savage pirate captains to ever haunt the world's oceans. Pirate legend Henry Every is a historically shadowy figure, and little is known of his childhood. Parish records from Devonshire indicate the birth of a child to John and Anne Avery on August 20th, 1659. But there is some indication he might have been born in 1653. His surname has on occasion been listed as Avery, but in almost every other instance throughout his life, he was referred to as Henry Every. He has been known by a variety of names, including Henry Every, John Every, Jack Every, Henry Avery, and John Avery. Confusing matters even more, we know that he adopted the alias Benjamin Bridgman, also known as Long Ben, during his early adult years. It has been theorized by some that Benjamin Bridgman was his birth name, and Henry Every was an alias. This is unlikely, but the vague history of his birth record makes it difficult to be certain. Henry Every spent his childhood in Devonshire, listening to tales of great military battles, English victories, treacherous Barbary pirates, and fantastic adventures. Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh were also from Devonshire and were legendary heroes of the time. All of this would have seemed utterly glorious to Every. Like his father, Henry began his career on the sea at a young age in the Royal Navy. It is not known whether Every joined willingly or if he fell prey to the numerous press gangs of the time. These notorious gangs routinely kidnapped and impressed young men and boys into the Royal Navy, and it is not out of the question that Henry was picked up by one of these gangs. The Life and Times of Captain John Avery was written by Adrian Van Bruck sometime around 1709. In it, Van Bruck writes that Every, quote, set sail from Plymouth aboard a fleet of men of war that was then going to suppress the nest of pirates at Algiers. He goes on to write, young Every shows an uncommon readiness in the practice of maritime affairs, and not only gets into the esteem of the officers of His Majesty's ship the Resolution, which he served aboard, but of the Commodore, Rear Admiral Lawson, having exerted an extraordinary vigor and sprightliness while Algiers was reduced to reason by the terror of the English navy. Lawson and the Resolution toured the Mediterranean in the early 1660s. If Every was born in 1653, it is possible he served on this ship with Lawson even at age 9 or 10. It wasn't unknown for boys of this age to work on Royal Navy ships as cabin boys, but it seems unlikely that a young boy would make such a noticeable impression on the Admiral. The first HMS Resolution was destroyed in 1666, and another HMS Resolution launched in 1667. It did participate in an attack on Algiers on the Barbary coast in 1671, but this ship did not have Admiral Lawson on board. It is more likely that Every was born in 1659, joined the Royal Navy as a cabin boy sometime around 1670 at age 11, and it is quite possible he was on board the second HMS Resolution. Every spent the next 2 decades working on various ships, including slave ships, in the Caribbean, and then aboard a freighter in the Bay of Campeche. Every rejoined the Royal Navy in 1689 during the 9 Years' War, and was assigned as a midshipman on HMS Rupert under Captain Francis Wheeler. HMS Rupert was a 64-gun warship, and it helped capture a large French fleet near Brest later in 1689. In 1690, Every achieved the rank of master's mate on board HMS Albemarle, which participated in the Battle of Beachy Head on the 10th of July, 1690. However, the English were routed in this battle, and Every was subsequently discharged from the Royal Navy on August 29, 1690. Back in England, he married Dorothy Arthur, who was employed as a wig seller in London. Henry Every disappeared from historical records for a few years, but he most likely took jobs on ships of the Atlantic slave trade. In 1693, his name reappeared when he was mentioned by Thomas Phillips, an agent for the Royal Africa Company. According to Phillips, Every worked for the governor of Bermuda as an off-the-books privateer outside of the legal slave trade monopoly of the Royal Africa Company. Every had captured many ships, even British ships, and took possession of them and all their human cargo and crew. Thomas Phillips was on board the vessel Hannibal off the coast of Guinea when he encountered the native peoples there. He wrote, "I have nowhere met people so shy as here, which makes me fancy they have had tricks played on them by such blades as Long Ben, alias Every, who have seized them and carried them away." Phillips also claimed that Every had been commissioned by Bermuda Governor Isaac Richier to engage in the slave trade. Phillips certainly was aware of Henry Every, and perhaps had encountered him personally. Every had made a name for himself, and enough of one for Phillips to also know of his alias, Long Ben. Every would have been about 34 years old at this time, or perhaps 40, depending on which birth date is correct. In 1693, Every was hired as first mate on board the vessel Charles II. This was a privateering ship, and its owners had hopes of plundering French buccaneers in the Caribbean and acquiring lost treasure from sunken Spanish galleons. The fleet of 4 ships left London for the port of A Coruña, Spain, but for unknown reasons, the voyage took 5 months instead of the planned 2 weeks. The ship was forced to anchor offshore, as the owners did not have the proper paperwork to come into the port. Every and the crew languished for months, waiting for the ship's owners to receive a letter of marque from the Spanish king, Charles II. Morale of the men soured, as provisions ran low, and the men were not being paid. Seizing the opportunity, Every began rousing the crews of the 4 ships. William Phillips of the vessel Dove claimed, "Every went up and down from ship to ship, and persuaded the men to come on board with him, and he would carry them where they should get money enough." During the night of May 7, 1694, while everyone else was asleep, Every and 25 men rushed Captain Gibson and captured the ship and the fleet without bloodshed. He offered Gibson the chance to join him as his second in command, reportedly saying, "If you have a mind to make one of us, we will receive you, and if you turn sober and attend to business, perhaps in time I may make you up one of my lieutenants. If not, here's a boat, and you shall be set on shore." Captain Gibson and the other officers chose not to join with Every, and they were given a boat and sent to shore, as promised. The men quickly elected Every as their captain. He declared, "I am captain of this ship now. I am bound to Madagascar with the design of making my own fortune, and that of all the brave fellows joined with me." Every sailed off with the 46-gun ship, which he renamed to the Fancy. Sailing south, Every came upon 3 British merchant vessels at the island of Mayo and Cape Verde, plundered the cargo, and recruited 9 of the crew. The Fancy then stopped at Guinea, where they pillaged a local tribe for food and anything else of value. After resupplying at the island of Bioko, Every captured a pair of Danish ships near the island of Principe and robbed them of their cargo of ivory and gold. The fleet departed again for the island of Johanna and quickly seized a French pirate ship, looted the vessel, and added some of its crew to his ranks. After arriving at Johanna, Every penned an open letter to English captains in the Indian Ocean. "I have never as yet wronged any English or Dutch, nor never intend whilst I am commander." This, of course, was untrue. He urged English captains to use a specific signal to identify themselves to avoid being pursued. Whether Every genuinely intended to avoid English ships is unclear. However, the chances are that he was doing his best to avoid attention from the East India Company, whose numerous and well-armed ships posed a significant threat to his fleet. The Fancy arrived in Madagascar in August of 1695. Here, more pirate captains added their ships to the fleet, including Thomas Tew, captain of the Amity, Joseph Farrow of the Portsmouth Adventure, Richard Want of the Dolphin, William Mays of the Pearl, and Thomas Wake, captain of the Susanna. Henry Every was elected as admiral of the entire flotilla, and they hatched a plan for a massive payday. Every and his conspirators planned to seize the annual treasure fleet from the Mughal Empire of India. The 6 ships of the flotilla sailed for the Red Sea, and waited patiently behind the volcanic island of Perim in the narrow strait of Bab el Mandeb. It was only a matter of time until they spotted their prey. Their prize was a floating castle of treasure, a vessel named the Ganj-i-Swai. This was the primary treasure ship of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. The Mughal fleet carried not only a treasure of vast wealth, but government officials and their families, and pilgrims returning from Mecca. It was a ripe fruit for the picking. There was one small complication for Henry Every. The Mughal convoy bound for Surat consisted of 25 ships. The 1,600-ton Ganj-i-Swai carried 1,100 crew and had 80 cannon. Its escort, Fatah Muhammad, was even larger at 3,200 tons, boasting 94 cannon and 800 crew. During the night of September 7, 1695, the convoy managed to slip past the pirate fleet under cover of darkness and made for the open ocean. When Every realized the convoy had escaped, he furiously pursued them all through the night. The Dolphin, Amity, and Susanna proved to be too slow and fell off the chase. However, the Fancy, Pearl, and Portsmouth Adventure caught up to the Fatah Muhammad by morning. The ship was the personal possession of Abdul Ghaffar, one of the wealthiest merchants of the Mughal Empire. Despite being well armed, it put up little resistance, and Every and his crew boarded the ship and pillaged its gold and silver, worth about $13 million today. An outstanding haul. But this wasn't their main target. Every continued his pursuit of the Ganj-i-Swai, finally catching up to her near the coast of Surat. Broadsides were fired at the Mughal vessel, and the Ganj-i-Swai returned fire from its 80 guns. Smoke and death filled the air, but Every's first shot was well aimed, as a cannonball smashed the mainmast of the Ganj-i-Swai, rendering her immobile. Every brought the Fancy alongside as the Mughal defenders blasted away in desperation. A massive musket volley from the Mughal soldiers repelled the pirates' first attempt to board. Just when it looked as if Every would be denied his prize, one of the Ganj-i-Swai's artillery pieces suddenly exploded, killed a great many, and caused mass chaos and panic. The pirate horde seized the opportunity and quickly swarmed the enemy ship. Savage hand-to-hand combat ensued. Captain Ibrahim ran below and armed the slave women with swords. Contemporary Indian historian Kafi Khan wrote, "The Christians are not bold in the use of the sword, and there were so many weapons on board the royal vessel that if the captain had made any resistance, they must have been defeated." After 2 hours of terrible bloodshed, Every and his men were victorious. Most of the soldiers and crew of the Ganj-i-Swai were slaughtered. Its passengers were subjected to barbaric torture over the next several days in order to learn the location of their personal valuables, before being thrown overboard. Unspeakable acts of violence were committed by the pirates over the next several days, especially against the women. Some threw themselves overboard rather than endure further suffering. Some of those left alive were taken prisoner on board the Fancy, and the remaining were left to return to India. Henry Every had obtained his prize. His booty included gold, silver, jewelry, gems, spices, silk, and manufactured goods. The treasures on board the Ganj-i-Swai were estimated to be around $100 million in today's value, and is believed to be the richest ship ever to be captured by pirates. The pirate fleet took their haul to the safe haven of Bourbon Island, now named Reunion Island, where a massive celebration was held. The treasure was divided among the crews of Fancy and Pearl, and each man now possessed riches to last the rest of their lives. The Portsmouth Adventure did not participate in the pillaging, but 2,000 pieces of eight were given to Captain Joseph Farrow before he parted ways with Every. While the pirate band celebrated, the world had taken notice of Henry Every and his exploits. The Mughal emperor closed down East India Company facilities in India and imprisoned its officials, and threatened an armed invasion of Bombay. Trade relations between India and the East India Company suddenly hit rock bottom. The East India Company was able to save the relationship by offering to pay full reparations for Mughal losses. In addition, Parliament in London named Henry Every as Hostis Humani Generis, or the enemy of humanity, and King William III issued a royal proclamation for the arrest of Henry Every and a £500 bounty for his head, plus a full pardon to any informant who provided information resulting in his capture. The East India Company doubled down and increased the bounty to £1,000. A worldwide manhunt was on for the dread pirate, Henry Every. Every departed with the Fancy in 1696, however some of his crew chose to remain on Bourbon Island. He then set course for the Caribbean, first stopping at Ascension Island for supplies, where several more of the crew decided to part ways with him. In St. Thomas, some of the gems and jewels were sold off before Every continued on to the Bahamas. He issued strict orders to his crew to refer to him only as Captain Henry Bridgman. The Fancy was anchored off the island of New Providence. Every was quite familiar with New Providence, and knew the small lawless shantytown of Nassau was a good place to hide out, and the governor was known to take bribes. 4 of Every's men took a small boat into Nassau, carrying a letter, an offer from Every to the Bahamian governor, Sir Nicholas Trott. Using the alias of Henry Bridgman, he declared he and his men as 113 interlopers, who had just arrived from Africa, and admitted to having a cargo of illegal slaves and ivory on board, in violation of the trade monopoly of the Royal Africa Company. Every offered Trott a sum of £860 in exchange for safe passage into Nassau for him and his men. He also promised to give the Fancy to the governor after all of its cargo was unloaded. Most importantly, he asked for the governor's silence. Governor Trott gladly accepted the offer and sent the men back with a return letter. He wrote of the crew as, quote, soldiers of fortune, who had done no Christian nation any damage and were the king's subjects. He gave permission for Every and his crew to come ashore and go as they please. Trott even sweetened the deal by also sending the men back with a cask of wine, a hogshead of beer, and a cask of sugar. The governor happened to be fearful of French invasion at the time, and considered the arrival of a pirate ship and its crew into Nassau as quite welcome. The men could help defend the city, and the presence of a 46-gun ship may prevent any invasion. Every and his men took their treasure cargo into Nassau. He met personally with Trott, and the Fancy was given to the governor as promised. It even included extra gifts, or bribes, of ivory, guns, and ammunition within its hold. After removing everything of value, Trott had the Fancy run into the rocks, where it broke apart and removed any further connection to Henry Every. When news of the bounty for Henry Every reached Nassau, Trott denied knowing anything about the pirate captain, or that Henry Bridgman was in fact the wanted Henry Every. Trott later stated that he saw no reason to disbelieve them, but he was forced to put out an arrest warrant for Every to hide his association with the known pirate, and he informed authorities of Every's whereabouts. But the duplicitous governor also tipped off Every and warned him of the impending arrest. Henry Every and his men disbanded and disappeared. What became of Henry Every and his crew is somewhat cloudy. Some stayed in New Providence, and 7 of them married and bribed Trott to sign royal pardons. Some of Every's crew took a vessel named the Isaac, while Every boarded the Seaflower, and sailed to the east coast of the American British colonies. Records show the arrival of a vessel named the Seaflower in Newport, Rhode Island in 1696, carrying a dozen slaves from the Caribbean. In 2014, ancient coins were found in Rhode Island and attributed to the Ganj-i-Swai. The coins have Arabic writing and were minted in Yemen in 1693. Similar coins were found in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maryland, and North Carolina. Some of Every's men bribed the governor of Pennsylvania in exchange for safe passage and were spotted walking around openly in the streets of Philadelphia. It is plausible and likely the men had split up across the eastern seaboard. In a 2021 article of the Newport Daily News, the state archaeologist of Connecticut, Sarah Sportman, stated, "It seems like some of his crew were able to settle in New England and integrate. It was almost like a money laundering scheme." An obscure sighting of Henry Every and the Seaflower was reported in 1696 in Ireland. Suspicions rose as the cargo was being unloaded, and Every disappeared for good. In 1698, an amnesty for all pirates was offered by the British government, but this specifically excluded Henry Every and William Kidd, who were still wanted dead or alive. William Kidd had originally set out to search for Henry Every before turning to piracy himself. Of all of Henry Every's crew, only 24 were captured, and 5 were ultimately executed. During the trial of John Sparks, he gave a confession to a court official regarding the savage brutality that he and his fellow pirates committed. The official recorded that Sparks, quote, expressed a due sense of his wicked life, in particular to the most horrid barbarities he had committed, which though upon persons of heathens and infidels, so inhumanely rifled and treated so unmercifully, declaring that he justly suffered death for such humanity. Sparks was executed by hanging in London in 1696, along with Edward Forsyth, William May, William Bishop, and James Lewis. In 1720, a work entitled The King of Pirates was published by Daniel Defoe. The work is presented as 2 letters written by Every himself. Its lengthy subtitle reads, "Being an account of the famous enterprises of Captain Avery, the mock king of Madagascar, with his rambles and piracies, wherein all the sham accounts formerly published of him are detected, in 2 letters from himself, one during his stay at Madagascar, and one since his escape from thence." This action-packed tale is generally regarded as a work of fiction. Another largely discredited book entitled A General History of Pirates was published in 1724, under the name of Charles Johnson. It is widely believed now that this was a pen name for Daniel Defoe. The author asserts that Every sailed to England, settled in Devonshire, and lived in poverty after attempting to sell his diamonds, and being cheated by merchants in Bristol. Another legend claims that Every established himself as king of a pirate utopia called Libertatia in Madagascar. But this is a romantic fantasy, as no evidence whatsoever exists of any such pirate community. In 1781, John Nill, collector of customs in St. Ives, Cornwall, wrote of meeting a descendant of Henry Every. Nill wrote, "His father had told him that Captain Every, after wandering about in great poverty and distress, had died in Barnstaple, and was buried as a pauper." This is a possibility, but we simply have no evidence to support this claim. It is fair to assume, however, if general knowledge existed at the time of Henry Every's identity, he almost certainly would have been apprehended. A mysterious letter in the archives of Crescent Colonel in Cornwall begins with, "Avery the Pirate." It claims the pirate was shipwrecked at the Lizard, the southernmost tip of Cornwall, and 3 chests of treasure were buried. The letter, written partially in French, goes on to describe specifically where the treasure was buried and the contents of the chests. It is not clear who wrote this letter, as it is unsigned. Several treasure hunting ventures are underway to find the buried treasure, using this letter as a guide. So far, the location of the treasure remains a mystery. No record of Henry Every exists after 1696, and his fate remains a mystery. Whether he lived out his days in England, Ireland, Scotland, Madagascar, or parts unknown, we may never know. But his reputation as one of the most savage, violent, and successful pirates lives on, earning him the title of King of Pirates.